Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we're once again this week joined by our guest host, Dr. Dario Nardi. Dr. Nardi, welcome back to Personality Hacker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So we recorded a podcast with Dario about markers of type development or cognitive function development when you're going through, whatever ends up being your developmental journey. And in those conversations, one of you, Dario, were doing something that I love that you do, which is that you gave references to people in the type community that have been in this community for decades that maybe don't have any online presence or, maybe don't have any familiar, or people listening to this podcast might not have any familiarity with them because they're part of sort of like an old guard of typology, and yet their resources are so fantastic. And that started us on a conversation about different communities that are found within sort of the ultimate umbrella of the type community, like maybe 4 different, you could almost call them factions. And that conversation was interesting enough that we wanted to kick on the microphone and maybe talk about what these communities look like and how they evolved.
Yeah, and I think just from the standpoint of somebody listening, maybe your only engagement has been through YouTube videos or some online articles like, how each type shows up at Christmas time or, like a listicle or something. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg of so much that's here around typology that's, like Antonia said, has been worked on for decades.
Yeah, so there really is a huge history. Psychological Types was published almost 100 years ago. In German, I think it took a few years for it to appear in English. And by the 1940s, people were really, Isabel Myers and Myers-Briggs are certainly the most well-known, really starting to run with it. But Jung also had his own sort of coterie of followers, although he hated the idea of there being Jungians. And that's one of the factions is individuals you might have in, nearby major city, your city maybe, a Jungian institute, and they talk a lot about stuff that Jung did much later in his career because he did the type stuff fairly early, but type is a part of it, and he saw it as a clinical tool, as an analytical tool, as a depth psychology tool. It goes by different names, and those folks they really have no interest in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, types, or any of the I would say like musings that people have, or even practical questions like, is there a relationship between ADHD and extroverted intuiting or whatnot? That said, there is a Journal of Analytical Psychology, which has been around for many decades and has thousands of articles. And so this is a group of people who is very concerned about Jung's ideas and placing those in type within the context of those ideas. And so I think that it's very valuable because so many people interested in type really don't know anything else about Jung. And the Jungians are like, hello, over here there's another 98%. And they have journals and so on and books. So I think that's really worthwhile faction. It's not my favorite, but it's good to know that it's there.
Yeah, I remember reading, Joel and I did a series of podcasts on 2 books that were written by Jean Shinoda Bolen called Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man. And she's actually a Jungian psychologist. And so as you go through these different goddess archetypes, she aligns them with the different cognitive functions. And interestingly enough, me reading the books and reading them through the lens of somebody who focuses on Jungian explanations of cognitive functions primarily through personality types, I would be like, oh, no, I wouldn't have aligned those 2 things at all. I wouldn't have seen that there at all. But I also am bringing like all sorts of information coming at it from a completely different lens than this person is. And so I had to train myself to go, no, I need to look at this not through the lens of type and through the lens of functions as they relate to type, but on her terms, on the terms that she was looking at him through the lens of Jungian psychology. And so they really, it's easy to see them as a cross section of each other, but really they are their own unique worlds.
Yeah, and they really are each one. And in the 1960s, the Gray wheelwright assessment was developed for the 8 functions to give you a profile of each function. But it really didn't gain much traction, and certainly it's not something people will find to use on the internet, in part because the definitions, there really is a strong tendency to stick with what exactly Jung wrote, and to try and distill that down in a way that, for people who are using type today, makes, say, introverted sensing and introverted feeling look very different than the way most people in type, when they think of types, would think of them. So I think that there's, that aspect to be careful, as you said, to take it on their terms. And then there are some like genuine Jungian psychiatrists, for example, like Dr. John Beebe, who really has made a huge attempt. Not only is he a Jungian and a psychiatrist, and he sees patients, but to like bring, like depth to the world of the Myers-Briggs types. And so there are those folks too.
You mentioned Dr. Beebe, and Antonia and I listened to a recording of his that Antonia found online. I think she purchased through his website or something, from back in the 1980s, where he gave a lecture and it was recorded. The audio is not that great, but it was a recorded lecture he gave. And it reminds me that as you move from the Jungian side of things into the actual Myers-Briggs, the typology world, there have been, there was an explosion in the 1970s and 80s of tons of work, and on into the 90s, of people doing work around this that didn't always make the digital transition to our new world that was so internet-based. And I think there's a wealth of information there that, especially in your research, I think you've tapped into a lot of those things.
Yeah, and that's, my training occurred, and the way that I went to conferences, not just the certification, but conferences and so on, that was before the World Wide Web. And so my understanding of type and experience of it is quite different than people even 5 or 10 years younger than I am. So this is going back to the early 90s. And yeah, there's quite a number of people who have not made the transition. And this is a really great opportunity, as we actually transition to a different group of people, which I'll call the old guard, that there is an online database of literally thousands of bulletin articles, peer-reviewed published research, dissertations, master's theses, talks that are recorded, all of that on type. This is kept by the Center for the Application of Psychological Type, capt.org. And there they have a database, the Milo database, M-I-L-O. I don't remember what Milo stands for. But you go there and you can type in the search bar and you can find, like, say you want to know about autism and type, or you want to know about basically any kind of subject. I see this all the time on the internet in these type groups, type forums. They're like, oh, I wish somebody would do some research on like the autism and type or something like that. And I'm like, dude, there's already like 20 papers that have been published. Yeah. Like in journals and stuff, like it exists.
Yeah.
And I provide the links to people. And what's really sad is I almost never, ever get feedback like, oh, that article you linked to or that location was really helpful. Or, the conversation, I see it continues for many pages on the forum. Nobody bothered to go and look at even the abstracts of the research, because it's all, a lot of type is about the personal validation today rather than the research aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So that's, well, I guess that brings us then to two different groups, and those would be the old guard, and then what we would call like I would call them, the meme people. But it's people, who are interested in type. They're enthusiasts.
Did you say the mean?
Good word.
Did you say the mean people?
Meme.
Oh, meme people.
Yes, meme. And by the way, for those who are wondering, meme does have a specific origin in the 1970s by Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackwell, and it's like completely misused today. Like that's not what memes are. But okay. So there is this old guard. And those are the people who started to get training, especially in the United States, in the English-speaking world, from Isabel Myers and her group that developed the MBTI. And a lot of the training was in the 70s, some of them as late as the 80s. Some of them did not come to type that way. They came through David Kiersey, and he was a marriage and family therapist. He was also the college professor, and you may know him through his book Please Understand Me and so on. It's about temperament and then interaction styles from his student Linda Behrens. And so there are dozens of these individuals, but most of them are retired. Most of them are still alive, but they are retired. A few, like Otto Kroger, have passed away. But Linda Behrens, Roger Pearman, Danielle Poirier. I might technically group Steve Myers with them, but I think Steve Myers is more our generation in practice, which is a new guard. And these people, almost all of them, have practical training as psychologists, counselors, organizational development specialists, like degrees. They went through an MBTI certification program before it was outrageously expensive. And they really grew up in this environment where everything was about face-to-face work and about ethics. So there was an ethics portion of the exam. I do see quite a bit of informal use of type today that's done on the internet, which is like really seriously in violation of American Psychological Association ethics guidelines. And so there really was this tremendous like professional grounding, very professional. And some of them, really stuck to the Myers-Briggs dimensions, the dichotomies, and others really got into innovating in some ways, like Roger Pearman in emotional intelligence, or Linda Behrens in temperament and interaction styles. There are many, many more. Eve DeLunis of wonderful, wonderful work, her stuff on survival games, personalities play. And these are the folks that you're only going to find their work in a bookstore. I mean, it could be Amazon, but they generally don't have an online presence. Or if they do, it's primarily for the organizational level. They're working now at their level. They're in their 60s and 70s, mostly boomers. They're working in big organizations, and they don't do internet interviews and all of that. But they have great wisdom to give. They also reflect a lot of the values of baby boomers, and I think that has, will also hold back what it is that they can offer, which is why a new guard is needed. And before I go on, I'm taking up a lot of oxygen here with these.
No, I was just going to say, what I love about the old guard is it's a reminder that there's a sense in the modern world that all of the world of psychology turned its nose up at this. Like, I sometimes describe typology as sort of the bastard love child of the psychological world. But there's this sense that, like, anybody who's serious, a serious therapist or a serious psychologist or psychiatrist or whatever would never go down this road. And that's just not true. The old guard is proof that there were entire cohorts in that world that very much took to typology, or at least portions of it, and understood its value. And so what I love about the old guard is it reminds us that not everybody snubbed all of this because, it wasn't serious enough. They took it very seriously. And like you said, that they made sure to preserve all of the same ethical considerations that one would weave in if they're trying to maintain ethics in the psychological realm.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of the research that was done which was in the 1960s, was done by Princeton Review and EDS, who are the people who make the SAT, and ACT and so on. And so it was dealt in a very professional, statistically rigorous manner. Most of the statisticians who did work on the in-use version of the MBTI, which was Form G, and then that was replaced in the 90s with Form M, those are all university faculty. So the idea in psychology even, so this idea that, personality psychologists or all of academia don't use it or whatever, I mean, that is itself false. It's not popular in psychology today, but in America, but then Jung is not either, because Jung's ideas don't really fit with American concepts of empiricism, which means that you generate numbers that you can do statistical analysis on. And if you can't do numbers and statistical analysis, then it's, quote, not scientific, which is not really the definition of science, or how science is even done in Europe, where Jung is more popular. So yeah, there very much is this older guard of people that really came with these strong backgrounds and have very strong sense of ethics and appropriate use, and understand, for example, that type should not be used to predict performance in a person's job role. which is an idea often lost on critics. And there aren't really actually that many critics. There's just a few haters, and then there's a lot of people who just grab on to the haters. That's and it's unfortunate. So the good news is the old guard has preserved a tremendous amount of stuff. The challenge is that you have to go look for it in these repositories, or you have to find a book. Because it's not free, and it's not floating around in 18 different places on the internet.
Right. Well, and the Milo database that you're talking about, we'll make sure to have a link for that underneath this podcast on our website, because it is a really rich database and source. So I highly recommend, if you, the listener, have the time to do so, go check out that database.
What a sexy word, database. I mean, that just sounds so fun and exciting. Database. But then that's kind of the point, right? Like, this old guard has so much wealth of information, and, outside of any books maybe that like Otto Krieger or Kiersey published that, hit like bestseller levels, a lot of this is, I mean, it might be difficult to approach for most people because it's deeper work, more nuanced. There's a lot there. Database, just the idea of a database makes some people's eyes cross. So there's this whole new generation, though, of people on the internet that are writing articles, shooting videos that have the sizzle dialed in. Like, it is sexy, it is exciting, it is interesting. They're out there having a really great interface, and they're communicating well. And sometimes, you talked about meme earlier. I took it for mean. But you were talking about memes, and it's like it ends up being distilled down to like bumper sticker slogans sometimes. And also it lacks the depth of content. And so I think there's an opportunity here to see, and not everybody, there's people online that are doing really good stuff. Sometimes I don't see them referencing some of this older work, potentially. But there's probably a reconciliation between maybe this older depth work and some of the new ability to communicate online. There might be a marriage of the two in the in-between part.
I do see that, and I see, especially as the old guard is retiring, that there is a newer generation coming up, and that newer generation consists, I feel, of two groups of people. One is that maybe over the past 10 years, there's been quite a number of people who sort of, through personal interest, have started a YouTube channel and put out dozens or maybe even hundreds of videos. And they've maybe even started to do workshops or to do consulting with people. Maybe they got a certificate or a degree, and they started to take it more seriously. And there are people like that. And then there are also individuals like myself who, have been busy doing other things in life, but had type interest on the side and are now becoming the new old guard. I mean, we're not old yet, but individuals who were trained by the old guard and know all of the history and the resources and all of that, and yet at the same time still have the youth and energy to say, like, hey, what's out there. And by the way, to really pay attention to some of the innovations that are needed, like people saying, like, hey, there's more than one facet to each function. Maybe we can talk about masculine, feminine, or plus minus, or whatever version of each function. Like, maybe there's something really to that. And when I see it 3, 4, 5 different places done different ways, I'm like, they really see value in it, even if they're not developing it in any way that approaches, anything professional. Like, there's like a brainstorming onto a piece of paper, or, but so I do see that there's like a separating wheat from chaff process going on right now. So on the one hand, you still have tons of people out there, like literally, I'm probably several million people who around the world who are engaged on a regular basis, daily or at most weekly, producing stuff around type. Nobody, by the way, does that for 5-factor model, because 5-factor model is yawn. The whole model is, it's like Mac versus Windows, and who is the cool one. But there's deeper reasons for it as well, because type is a developmental model, and I do appreciate people have moved in that direction. But yeah, I just want to say to the young folks who are getting into type, or maybe not so young, to know that there's this huge body out there. And I'm seeing that, for example, Personality Hacker is a relatively young, new organization that is following through with the, I don't necessarily say complexity, but valuing the subtlety and the ethics and really going about things, seeking a professional path forward, making type useful, understanding sort of the what to convey to people and what's needed, and all of that is great. So I really see in the coming 5 to 10 years more of the new guard drawing from some of the internet people, but a number of individuals like myself who come more from academia or practice, and bringing the new ideas. The Mina Barmani at Johns Hopkins University, her research results are fantastic. I think in the end they will do more to support type in American academia than my own research, to be frank, because it's just more like traditional statistical analysis.
Yeah.
Of course, the neuroscience. So we're seeing advances in type. I imagine there's going to be more in the future. Some people think things like, oh, looking at faces or body motion, like that's completely new. Nobody's done that before. And I'm like, no, actually, there are people who've been in Europe who've been doing that since the 80s or even before that, who have whole companies that consult and all of these things. So
Yeah.
there's very much that's not new under the sun, but has its time come to shine. And I think a lot in these the coming decade is going to be seeing these nuances with type really come out and shine and make type new for the 21st century.
You mentioned a few things that are expanding how we type people or determine type, based on body movements or eye movements thing. I have this dream, this like visionary dream that we'll have some ubiquitous final test at some point someday. I know this may be out of the realm of what's actually possible, but take a blood test and it just tells you your type. So we can move past all of this guessing game or trying to determine type, because I think a lot of it's a distraction. Well, on one hand, it's a distraction because the whole point of this is once you know your type, now you have a map to grow yourself. There is some benefit in discovering type, because I think in the process of either discovering it for yourself or like what we teach in profiler training, helping another person discover it, co-creatively, there is benefit to that process. The discovery process itself can teach us a lot about ourselves and how we're wired. And also it might be nice to be past that. So now we can go into the application of type, get past the whole, trying to build a better system. Everybody's out building these better tests and better systems for diagnostic. Well, that's great. But let's say we get that perfected, what comes next? And that's what I'm always interested in. I think that's what Personality Hacker is interested in, is what's the development that can be built upon the type. And I don't know, that just came up as you were talking about, some of the avenues of growth are, I think, in the application as well as the diagnostics of type.
Yeah, for sure. And so much around type, especially even to call on like the meme group, is around finding your type, not even your best fit type. There's just a whole bunch of debate around analyzing and typing people and not really a thought to what to come next, and not very good tools. There's because the Myers-Briggs folks failed to protect their IP. They lost that day in court, and now anybody can make a MBTI knockoff as long as they don't actually use MBTI. And there's a lot of stuff out there which has no validation, and people take, the 5 different tests, and they call them tests. By the way, it's not a test, because the word test means you can pass it or fail it. You can't fail at a type sorter. And so just even like little wordage, ethics, things like that. It is presenting a challenge. I'm going to present a word, epistemology. I don't think that we can know through some like objective measurement process definitively what a person's type is, because it's at a different ontological level.
Sure.
That's the second word. What I mean is that if we're going to give people a physiology test, what we end up measuring is physiology. If we give people a brain imaging test for brain wiring, then that's what that's the data we're working from and what we'll be able to analyze. Is the reason why the MBTI instrument cannot be used to prove or disprove Jungian functions, because it has no function questions in it and addresses a different ontological level. And so there are these different, like, what level are we looking at? Well, type is at the level of psyche. And psyche is something that continuously changes throughout time, throughout culture, different parts of the world. I do believe, of course, we can create better type instruments, and I and others have been pushing for that in the past 10 years. I do believe we'll get better assessments. I also believe in the assessment process itself, that Linda Behrens and I developed this triangulation process that's based upon what's called reconstruction analysis in mathematics. Like there really is thought given to how can we assess things. It's like, patting the elephant in different places. And yeah, three of the people who are, touching the elephant, there are three people and they're all blindfolded, but there's a way to triangulate what it is that they're seeing and to get it typed. So I think there's some really great processes, and I'm fully on board with you that the superpower of type, to use a catchy phrase, is about development. And that is something, five-factor model has no model, which is sort of funny. It has no explanatory power. There's no developmental aspect to it. Their attempts to link it to brain imaging results have largely met with failure. I mean, they can publish some results, and they do, but they're not interesting correlations. There's no surprise or addition. So I really do believe that the more we focus on development in a way that's like as scientifically based as we can, and based in processes of like interviewing people to create type profiles as opposed to just some person randomly at their desk writing them, that we really can carry the value of type forward. And obviously, many, many millions of people see value in type.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I'm glad you said this about, my pipe dream, my vision dream. I know it's abstract. I know it can't be actually done. I know by the nature of this, it is a subjective, dynamic experience for people. Their type is changing. It's dynamic. So I know that my dream can never become reality. I think it's an answer ultimately to everybody that wants to make this objective, wants to make this like hard science of like, this is how we'll determine it. My wish is that we could just put that behind us, because I actually do see value in the subjective dynamic nature of type. That's why we do profiler training with our students, because in that process, there's some magic that happens as you, the person that's doing the profiling, for example, being the instrument themselves. And I think there is because you're filtering things through your subjective experience, you're helping somebody else come to their best fit type through their subjective experience. There really is no way to make this objective or purely objective, I should say.
Well, I think originally you were talking about a fantasy.
Yeah.
And the reason why there's that fantasy is not because, like you guys just beautifully articulated, the benefits that come with the journey of discovering one's best fit type. And I mean, we have, by the way, we have one of those knockoff Myers-Briggs assessments on our website. We totally created one.
I even call it a test for SEO reasons.
But we call it the assessment on the actual page, I think. But that said, it's a total knockoff, and one of the reasons is because that's the first place everybody goes. Like that's the point of entry is, okay, so you're talking about types. Well, what's my type? And I think the reason why you're talking about that fantasy, Joel, is the fantasy is so that maybe the upcoming new guard pays a little less attention to building a better mousetrap and a little more attention to the implications.
Absolutely.
And the applications. And like Dario was talking about the subtleties of it. Because I think for us, what we decided to do, and we actually move kind of slow for some people in the personality type community, like the people who are learning from the new guard. We seem to move quite slow because we don't throw everything in the kitchen sink into all of our type descriptions. We're not referencing a million different ways to look at it in a million different lenses, because everything we introduce, we want to make sure that we perpetually focus on, okay, what's the growth opportunity here? We don't want to move so fast so that people go, oh, it's just all about taking in new information and building a better mousetrap. There's actually there's wisdom to be culled here. There's application. There's not just information to soak in. There are life changes that could be made based on this information. And those life changes happen slowly. Integration happens slowly. And so we have intentionally paced ourselves. It took us probably 5 years, maybe, I think, right, to start talking about shadow functions. That was very intentional. Like, we really didn't want to start talking about shadow functions until we'd laid a lot of groundwork for how much type development is represented in your first 4 functions. And then slowly pepper in the other concepts, because we want to make sure people understand that this is about, well, at least for us, it's about growth. Now, our wish about that doesn't mean that we're right. Like, there's plenty of room for learning every piece of a system and creating like a machine of taking people's best concepts from all of these different, lenses to see type through and then put them all together. There's value in that. And some people get great value. That's the speed of their learning, or maybe they just want to take in more information. They're just fascinated by it. And there's value in that. We recognize it. There's also value in building a better mousetrap. Because if like the fantasy or the wish is that someday machine learning just handles it for us, I'm with you, Dario. I think that we're talking about on some level, and I hate to get too woo-woo, but on some level we're talking about a soul as well, right? Like, it's all the manifestations of your type filtered through your identity, which is almost impossible to really create good or any metrics for in some ways, right? It has to be a discovery process.
Yeah. And I think you brought up something too, which is important. There's a lot of people who are, interested in type, and they started YouTube channels and so on. Most of them are in their 20s. A few are in their teens or early 30s. And, I feel like I still made very meaningful contributions to type in my late 20s and 30s. At the same time, I didn't have the wealth of life experience that I've gained even being 50. And the old guard, one thing they really brought was the decades of their own lives. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that they racked up experience using type with clients or something, but, it comes down to people saying, like to me, for example, well, you can't really be an INTJ because. And I'm like, first of all, not all INTJs are autistic or whatever it is. And I did spend my formative years in the Caribbean in a culture that's an ESFP culture. And then someone responded like, this was like a Reddit thing. It's like, well, I don't see what that has to do with anything. And I'm like, if you don't understand how culture influences the expression of type, then I'm like, you're just like way behind on the boat. I was like, we can both be INTJs, and I didn't say this, but this is what I thought at the time, and I have said it since then. What I wanted to say is like, you're a 4th level technician, and I'm a 12th level wizard. And that's fine. I've been alive 25 years longer than you. I get to be higher level. Mm-hmm. I worked to get here, but that means I'm going to look different.
Yeah.
And I understand my 3rd and 4th functions and use them in a way that you don't. And that's okay. Like, that's where you are in life. But there's this sort of like 2-dimensional understanding of type, which even when the person is well-intentioned, they simply have not been through the experience yet. And like midlife is a truly meaningful experience to go through. And that's, so I do look forward on the plus side of that, seeing a lot of maturing and filtering that happens. Those people who are serious about using type, gaining more traction and more visibility, more education for themselves as well. Along with, and I do believe, by the way, some people are better than others at profiling. So I think that we can create instruments, and even AI systems that are better than the average person, for sure. So I think, Joel, your dream is like 80% possible.
Good to know.
Yeah. Which brings us to, last but not least, I think I would be remiss to not mention Socionics. Not because, there are a number of systems out there which have been created largely by, NT males in their 20s who are looking for their particular take on type. And I think they're engaged in a psychological project of like trying to understand themselves and others, and that's fine. Like we all do that. But they tend to be very complex and to deviate from the type history and database of knowledge. To some points, I'm even aware of one who brags that he's never read Jung. I'm like, dude, that's not helping you. But there is this other tradition, Socionics, which is actually sort of like the Eastern European Russian tradition, which has a tremendous amount of development and thought and the equivalent of what we think of as the type community, but in the other half of the Western world. And Socionics went from Jung and went in different directions. And one of those, I think, intertype relations, very, very interesting, very useful, looking at every single type and how they work with every other type. I've read a lot of stuff there that is, mostly I'm familiar with Viktor Golenko's work, who's Ukrainian, that I think is really high quality. And it goes to one of those things that people ask, like, what type am I? And I'm like, well, what types are your friends that you get along well with, like your close friends? For me, like, those are almost all either fellow NTs or they're FP types. And there's a reason for that, because it's like INTJ, introverted feeling third, like, let's go for those FPs. And so there's, just different ways of looking at type. The quadra is another example. Victor in particular came up with these 4 subtypes which actually mesh really well. It was just a completely random accident of somebody bringing us together, saying we're doing a little presentation on ENFJ, like, could you say something from your brain imaging research? I just sort of sorted the brain wiring of ENFJs into 4 groups, and I'm like, oh my God, these like match really, really well with Victor's 4 subtypes for ENFJ, like, remarkably well. And that began like a whole beautiful process. So I think in terms of these communities, besides to sort of recap it, there's the Jungians who are still in operation today, and some of them completely never get into type in any public way, don't really care about it that much. Others, even people, not just John Beebe, but like Lenore Thompson and so on, have crossed over a little bit. The old guard, which are people trained by Isabel Myers and Mary McCulley and others who came after them. Whole organizations, American Association of Psychological Type, Australian and British associations of psychological type, like truly professional organizations. The new guard, individuals, more Gen X people. Those would be individuals like me and the 2 of you, who are taking like a very professional approach to type. We're just younger, and we're bringing our own sensibilities. All of those people on the internet who are enthusiasts, who are generating material, and they maybe are not even going for professional material, but they're enthusiasts. And then Socionics. And I think some of Socionics can also be like insanely, ridiculously mathematical or abstract. And like that, Socionics Model A for me doesn't hold much interest. But, then there are parts of type that are like that. So I would say that those are like 4+1 type communities.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the thing that stuck out is that I hear attitude about each of these communities from each of these communities about each other. Like,
Yeah.
I'll read something where a person's like, well, they've completely, like somebody who's maybe in a Reddit forum about Myers-Briggs complaining about how it's not truly Jungian, and they post every single comment is like, well, it's not truly Jungian. And it's like this person is, arguably somebody who would be more of a Jungian style that is just kind of has an axe to grind with all of the personality type world. And so the fact that it's not pure in their mind is like, that's a problem. And then I hear some challenges with like the new guard being frustrated with memes, or people who are just into the meme level, like creating content that get frustrated with some others. And they're on some level, there's actually value, I think, to all of them. Like I would call, I know of somebody who has a listicle, a type-based listicle website. Like she primarily creates content that are listicles, but she knows so much. All of her listicles are really good. Like you can learn a lot about type from her blog posts, even though they're very much designed to have a lot of that sizzle, right? Everybody loves a good listicle. But she knows her stuff, and so she's creating a lot of really solid content on there. So like everybody in, I think, this world has some value to give. Like people, there are a lot of people who are not into personality hacker because we're too growth oriented. Like they just want to get the content. They just want the data and the information and give me more and more and more information and content. We don't, we're not, we don't like the data and the information as much as we like the knowledge and wisdom. And so we weigh more on application and how do you implement this in your life and how do you integrate. And that's a slower moving process than data and information. And they want it faster. And there are some people out there that are part of the new guard that's what they're doing. They're providing information as fast as they can provide it. And they're more data and information, less of the knowledge and wisdom piece. And that's great. And I think within all of these subcultures and even looking at each of these subcultures from a new place, I think there's value to all of it. And I think a part of it is just kind of understanding each of these places, position in the ecosystem. What do they provide? And then getting good at figuring out which is the element, which is the subculture that has the most to offer you at what moment in the timeline. And so I think there's value to sort of looking at it in this way and maybe seeing the value that each of these different subgroups brings.
Mm-hmm. I do want to agree with you in particular that there are certain, I'm going to say like type enthusiasts who post, not a lot of them, but a few I've run across who like clearly have a very talent or intuitive, like just genius understanding of type. There's one, and she doesn't even put her name on her blog. I've encountered it 2 or 3 times. And a lot of it is from like a very, like for people who have, she's probably NF, for people who are having like psychological problems and type responses around those. And I read through it and I'm like, she really knows her stuff. And probably only a few thousand people know who she is. So I really see that something wonderful, beautiful that we could do, and either just to encourage it to happen naturally, or for people to make a little bit more of an effort, maybe to do some sifting, to help these people come together. Because this is what happened in 1979, is that there was a beginning of a lot of people in the type world getting interested, but there wasn't a type world yet. There were just people who were interested. And somebody said, let's create a research center, CAPT. Let's create an organization, APT, Association of Psychological Type. Let's create these things that allow people to connect and to find all of the good stuff in one place, understanding that in a sense we're competitors, although at that time people were mostly geographically separated. In the 70s and 80s, you're not going to drive to LA to go hear that person when, if you live in Chicago, there's already a type training that's in the Chicago area. And so I think what you're saying there is really great too, that because every person automatically is going to bring something different. Like I can think, for example, someone I know who has a fairly high profile and is controversial online in his presentation of type. And there are many people who absolutely love him. I like him personally. There are also people who hate him, like vociferously. And so he's for some people. And then there's folks like yourselves, and there's people, I don't really do trainings. There's something for everyone. So I think that we can separate in the coming decade, or help be mindful of, who are the up and coming stars who are really going to contribute to the health of our communities, the health of the planet. That's what Isabel Myers has hoped for. I mean, she developed and really pushed out the MBTI during World War II. And it was, a half of the reason was to help bring peace to the world. And in some cases, all we just have now is a false peace and a bunch of Cold Wars. And internally within our own country and within many countries, and not to mention between them. So how can we use type? Everybody's going to have their different uses. So I think we're good on it, like absolutely. Yeah. I just, as a last thought, I want to remind people there's something that's called the manual. It's the MBTI manual, and you can find it on Amazon. It exists. So MBTI is not something, I have nothing to do with the MBTI publisher or whatever. It's not something that was just made up that's unscientific. It actually has more research than any other personality instrument in existence. And there's like a whole 500-page manual for it.
And I think what particularly people who are up and coming can benefit from things like the manual you're referring to, and even the old guard that was part of the ecosystem at the time period that manual and other elements of type were being discovered and invented and worked on and figured out, is the one thing that we really need to, I think, take from the old guard is the insistence on ethics and making sure that that piece doesn't get lost. Because as much as there's been an insane amount of research put into all of these different pieces, one thing that when we lose access or interest in all of that research that came before, first of all, we are reinventing the wheel and sometimes not for the better, number one. And number two, there was that sort of sense of ethics that was a vein of gold through everything that was created. And sometimes we lose out on that too, just culturally. So I think the value in remembering that there is something that came before is that came before the standing on the shoulders of giants and that sort of thing, comes from a place that is not just well-intended, but had some rigor to it. And so then recognizing that maybe we need to add a little bit more to everything we're doing too, like add a little bit more of that ethical rigor, ask ourselves why we're doing what we're doing, what we're attempting to gain at the end of all of it. How can we make sure that we're being responsible with the little bits of information we have, the information we're gaining over time, and what we're rolling out.
Yeah, the ethics part was very much drilled into me. I mean, that was even an exam on that, and just the way that type is used. Like people will contact me and ask me, "Can you type me?" And I'm like, I don't do that. Like, I'm not going to tell you what your type is. Like, I can give you a couple of assessments and take you through a self-discovery best fit process. But there are people who advertise that you pay them money and they will tell you what your type is, not take you through a process. They'll just tell you your type. Then that sounds like a little bit like a cult to me. It's not working with the person live, even in a sense, like with profiling, asking them questions, helping them, reflect on what's going on, giving them reflection and feedback. And I'm like, that's the kind of thing that gives type a bad name. Just as in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, what gave type a bad name is organizations that in some cases were even using the MBTI instrument illegally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For example, we're only going to hire, like we want top salespeople. We're only going to hire ESTPs and ESTJs because that's what we found is working in our organization. And then to give prospective employees MBTI or whatever, and then they only hire based on the instrument result, not even showing the results of the person. Maybe it was wrong. Like that's actually illegal in California.
Yeah,
you can't do that. But organizations were doing that anyways, and it was very much test and tell, very simplistic. There was no type dynamics. What it means, the functions, or the 8 functions. And it really just like, that's what gave type a bad name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation about these different communities. I think this is it's really good to kind of have a sense of where people are coming from in the groupings and how people are showing up. I think that's a really good lens to be seeing this through as we do, you listening, you might be doing online research, you might be listening to different people talk about things, just kind of knowing where they might be coming from, which community they might be tied to or being emerging from is valuable. Dr. Nardi, would you be willing to talk a little about your Magic Diamond book? I do want to mention that on this because I think there's a fantastic resource in your newest book. Briefly, and we need to wrap up here, but if you have a moment just to tell a little bit about that book to the listener.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an accumulation of 20 years of materials that I've used mainly in workshops. And those really prompted me to think, well, maybe I'm going to hunker down for a few months and have a chance to put those all in one place for people. And that turned from like 20 pages or 30 pages worth of stuff into 430 pages, really starting from this premise of if we want to talk about personality, we need to talk about development. And just because even the definition of personality in academia over the last few years has shifted as they realize that personality cannot be defined as a static or stable set of characteristics or traits. Like it's not working. The longitudinal studies say that's not true. And so to really for people to be able to open up to their type or to go through an assessment process, a little one, to help them know where to start at least, and then honor every part of themselves. So that if I'm looking at it and I look at the introverted intuiting chapter, and I'm going to go through this process that really is multidimensional. Jung talked about every process and its role in society and how it would appear. Its strengths, its pitfalls, lots of great stuff. Jung was very critical of all of the types because he saw them as very easily dysfunctional. They're all examples of one-sidedness. And then pairing that with what does it look like as we start to develop here all these case studies and examples and suggestions for self-coaching. It's like if I want to develop TE with FI, what does that look like? How can I bring that into my life? And to just have like really targeted packets and process for that.
Fantastic. Thanks for being with us as a guest host on this show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us as a what do they call them, co-hosts?
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure to be here again with you too. Thank you.
You've been listening along to this conversation, but you haven't had a microphone on your side. But we want to hear from you. What's been coming up for you in this conversation? Come over to personalityhacker.com and directly below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, I always like to say this, share your story. Something that maybe in your life, an example of something that we've talked about today showed up for you. Maybe you're working through something. Maybe you've accomplished something or gotten through something in your life. We want to hear from you and your personal story. So over at personalityhacker.com is the best place to make your voice heard.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. Go pick up a copy of Dr. Dario Nardi's book called The Magic Diamond. I've been through it multiple times and with coaching, and it's fantastic. And if you're interested in finding a personal growth program tailored for your personality type, you can head over to personalityhacker.com, check out our catalog of programs, and see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I am Dario Nardi.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.